Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
If I asked you to think about a refugee arriving in Canada and seeking asylum, this is probably the stuff that would run through your mind.
Asylum seekers are still camped out here at Peter and Richmond. They have nowhere else to go. The shelters are full, and some of them have been here as long as 4 weeks.
Dozens remain camped outside of the shelter intake office downtown, and concern is growing over how the winter months could make an already dire problem much worse.
It seems to be a system where people are arriving to the U.S. very recently and right away are moving up into through Quebec.
Over the past few years, it has become clear to all levels of government and ordinary citizens as well that Canada isn't equipped to properly help asylum seekers. We don't have the homes, the funding, or even the processing capacity to handle the number of people arriving. And as a result, the Canada those refugees experience is often brutal and difficult. But it's easy, given these headlines, to forget that it wasn't always this way, at all. Even just less than a decade ago, Canada was looked upon as a model of how to welcome and acclimate refugees. You might remember this.
This is a wonderful night where we get to show not just a plane load of new Canadians what Canada's all about, but we get to show the world how to open our hearts and welcome in people who are fleeing extraordinarily difficult situations.
So what happened here? How did a country that made international headlines for the way it took in people fleeing war-torn countries end up with today's asylum seekers stranded on the streets, crammed into churches and motels and desperate for documents that would let them work? How did this model totally collapse in just 8 years? Or was it on the brink of collapse all along? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Jordan Michael Smith is a journalist based in Toronto who investigated the plight of Canada's asylum seekers for Maclean's. Hey, Jordan.
Hello, good to be here.
It is great to have you, and maybe just to put a face and a person to this crisis, you could start by telling us about Anne. What's her story? How did she find herself in Canada?
Sure. So Anne is a remarkable woman. She thinks she's about 40 or 41, but she doesn't exactly know because she was separated from her parents as a child, and she doesn't have any birth certificate or other type of records. As a child, she lived on the streets of Kampala, Uganda, which is in East Africa. She was one of a lot of homeless young people in the city, and she survived by collecting plastic bottles and scrap to sell to recyclers. She slept outside at night mostly and went to school during the day. And under these amazingly challenging circumstances, she still managed to get a scholarship to high school. She saved money and enrolled in university. She got a degree in international business and began a really successful career in business development for multinational corporations. And it's really important to say how that she was very successful, because we have sometimes the idea that asylum seekers are all arriving here penniless and that they have no skills or education. And as I found through my reporting, that's frequently not the case.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I should say that Anne is a pseudonym. Most of the asylum seekers that I spoke to arrived here often under dangerous circumstances, and Anne is no different. She was married and had 3 children, and she began to be a survivor of really violent abuse. She had to eventually flee Uganda, hoping for her kids to join later. And she went to the Middle East, where she wasn't really able to get any help, and a friend told her to try Canada. She was really desperate for refuge, and she arrived here with a visitor visa and a little money. And she found an Airbnb in Etobicoke, which is in Toronto's West End for your out of the city listeners. She got an Airbnb for 5 days last November in 2023. The first day that she arrived here, she phoned Legal Aid Ontario and said that she wanted to make an asylum claim. And she asked very specifically whether this would be a place that was safe for her and whether her children would be able to come after her. And she was told that her concerns would be dealt with in time, but for now, she was safe.
Mm.
And all she had to do was phone Central Intake, which is Toronto's 24-hour hotline for emergency shelter, and find a place to stay.
That sounds really simple and easy, right? It worked no problem?
Yes, well, that was the idea. But the problem was that when she phoned Central Intake, she was told that all the shelters were full and she had to call back. And so she kept calling back time after time over the next 4 days. And every time the operators told her that the shelters were full, that was when she could get through to operators. Often she was just waiting on the phone. And one casually suggested that she extend her Airbnb stay as if she had endless amounts of money and options. After 4 days, she figured it wasn't going to work. So she found a list of shelters in the city and she visited by bus and by foot, one by one. And each one, she was told the same thing. The beds were full and they couldn't take her in. So she went back to her Airbnb. At this point, she was looking at the snow piling up. She had never seen snow before, but it was actually terrifying to her because within a couple days, she knew she was going to be sleeping out there.
How many people like Anne are there out there right now in Canada? How is this country doing just in terms of the sheer number of asylum claims?
So in 2023, there were about 145,000 asylum seekers. And this year, we're likely to see those same numbers or higher.
How does that compare to, I don't know, 5 years ago, a decade ago?
It's significantly higher. Really, this actually started in about 2019, after some times where the numbers of asylum seekers had gone down for decades. In the past 5 years, the numbers have really started to increase significantly.
What changed?
There are a number of things. One is just the fact that the climate in many parts of the world have gotten worse. So you're seeing wars in Ukraine, wars in the Middle East. You've seen a flurry of anti-LGBT laws passed by governments in Africa that make it really dangerous for people who are LGBT just to live openly or secretly for that matter. And so a variety of factors have led to a huge number of migrants, people who are looking for asylum. They can't always go to their neighboring countries because their countries are fighting their neighboring countries, or their neighboring countries are not more hospitable than the ones they're leaving. And Canadian leaders have signaled that here is a place where we welcome refugees. You'll remember that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that asylum seekers would be safe here in response to, Donald Trump saying that the U.S. was closed to immigrants of all kinds.
You write in your piece that, for years, Canada had been seen as a world leader, both in just welcoming asylum seekers generally, but also in the way we took care of them and acclimated them to the country. What was that time like? How did that system work?
The system of Canada's refugee policy and policy for asylum seekers has evolved continually since the 1950s. And Canada has been a really world leader in something like the sponsorship program where private citizens can sponsor refugees. And that's been a really fantastic program that Canada has exported to many countries in the world. And generally, Canada was able to allow asylum seekers a safe place to stay, offer them some safe shelter and some resources so that they could find their own places to live and find jobs. And that's the part that is really broken down because Canada has a cost of living crisis for its own citizens and for newly arrived immigrants, for asylum seekers who often don't have much documentation attesting to their work history. Sometimes they don't have birth certificates. Often, they don't have any sort of employment records or other identification. Sometimes they don't speak English or other things that are going to make them competitive in our job market, the really staggering, shocking thing is that sometimes now we're allowing people in, but we're saying they have to go live on the street. And some people I spoke to are in fact saying that they're no better off than they were in their own countries. In fact, Anne wondered at one point whether she'd just go back and face what she left in Uganda because it could be no worse than what she was facing here in Canada.
How did that sheltering system fall apart? Was it just overwhelmed by sheer numbers or like a lack of volunteers? What happened to it?
It was a combination of two things. One, it was the sheer numbers of people arriving, and the fact that the Canadian government hadn't kept up with its promises of funding the nonprofits that assisted these people, that funded public housing that allowed for Canadians of all kinds, newly arrived and native born, to afford decent shelter. And so that's what has really broken down, is that housing for all Canadians has become much more difficult. And when it's difficult for native born Canadians and permanent residents, it's going to be doubly difficult for asylum seekers and refugees.
So, who is trying to cover that gap in the interim while hopefully governments are working on the long term problem? Like, who's stepping up here? I know you've met some of them.
So what you're seeing is sort of a patchwork of organizations. There are nonprofit organizations that exist to assist asylum seekers. A lot of them are started by asylum seekers or refugees themselves. They don't want their family members or friends or people from their communities to go through what they've gone through, and they set up organizations. A lot of them are churches that service the Africa diaspora. These are the places that are stepping in to do what governments should be doing and providing them with dignity and decent places to live. The problem is that these aren't institutions that are set up to do this over the long term. Black-led churches bankrupted themselves providing temporary homes for asylum seekers. That's not what they're set up to do. They don't have the infrastructure to do it. That sort of thing takes skilled professionals, trained professionals, permanent staff, and other types of infrastructure that they're just not prepared for.
In the bigger picture, then, what is being done to, I don't know, brace the system to improve it? I know cities like Toronto have publicly begged and threatened the federal government to try to get more money for housing for asylum seekers.
So what governments have begun to do is limit the number of international students that can arrive. That is something that's within their power. Canada is a signatory to various international treaties, and those treaties say that any asylum seekers who come here have a right to a hearing. So that's something that Canada has to honor. And so, in terms of financials, the federal government made what might be a one-time influx of cash to the municipal government, and the Ontario government has done the same. But there doesn't seem to be any effort to coordinate the resources across all three of governments or make any sort of long-term commitment to supporting asylum seekers. The federal government is just sort of leaning on the municipalities to handle it.
And how are the municipalities handling it? And I guess you've done an amazing job illustrating just how far behind we've fallen. Are we now maybe at long last gaining ground? Like, I know it's one thing to throw some money at the problem. It's another thing for that to actually translate to, open shelters with available beds.
Right now, there aren't as many asylum seekers on the streets. And so you could count that as a win. Instead, they're in hotels that are at least offer a shelter from the elements, even though they can often be awful places to live and they're very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose that is better. It doesn't really offer much of a long-term or even medium-term solution to the problem, but it has gotten the crisis out of the headlines. In terms of anything more sustainable than that, it doesn't really look like there's much being done.
When you talk to these organizations that are doing the work on the ground and helping people, what are they saying to you about the reality of what it's like right now and what comes next?
Well, they all say that it has gotten significantly worse over the past 5 years, and that there's a real increase in both the amount of asylum seekers and the desperation that they're facing. So these organizations are finding that the resources are more strapped, when in the past, some of them, for example, might help people get here. It might help set people up with jobs. Now they have to help find places to stay for the people. And that's not really what they're set up to do. That's what governments are supposed to do, ideally, is, have shelter so that when a person arrives at, the border, or make a claim once they're already inside the country, that they're given a list of places that they can go, and that those places have beds for them and private places for them to live. And that's the type of thing that really just isn't happening anymore.
Is there any change we could make to the rules around seeking asylum or the way we structure these programs that would help people right now, at least from ending up in places where there is no place for them, but the streets are, like you said, a very temporary shelter like a hotel?
Right. One thing that we can do is speed up the work permits. Virtually every person who I spoke to here, every asylum seeker is desperate to work. They all have skills of one kind or another, and many are highly educated, and they can't get a job because they're legally unable to. We can cut through some of the red tape and speed up the work permits, but the reality is that in many cities, such as Toronto, having a minimum wage job doesn't actually afford you housing. And a lot of asylum seekers want to be in cities because that's where their other community organizations, people they know, and other resources are. They're based in the big cities. It's much harder in small towns, even though the cost of living might be cheaper there. So in terms of integrating into the country for the long term, being in big cities is where they need to be, but they can't afford to be. So, really beyond significantly increasing the funding, there isn't much that can be done. So what needs to be done is for the federal government and the provincial governments to make sure that these injections of finances are not just one-off things, but they're continued supports alongside the municipal governments that are sort of the first line of defense.
I mean, the last thing that I want to hear from you, and I really appreciated the way that your piece just articulated how qualified and rich in education and talent some of these people are, because they're often just seen as people who come over and end up as burdens. Why don't you, if you can, tell us what happened to Anne?
Sure. So Anne was able to link up with the pastor of a Black church who did what governments wouldn't and said, come stay with us. His church welcomed Anne in, where she was able to stay for a month with other people from Central and East Africa. And that's really critical because you had people who knew their ways of living. For example, men and women were segregated, not in terms of everyday life, but in terms of sleeping. Well, after a month, the Black church said they couldn't afford to do it anymore. And Anne was taken into a Toronto shelter, and the shelter was just a nightmare where they were staffed by people who were not culturally sensitive, places that were overburdened, that did not have adequate heating or bedding. And after several months of that, she was offered to take a bus to a different shelter, and she figured she would take her chances. That couldn't be any worse. And eventually where she landed is in a hotel in Kingston. There are 4 people to a room. It's certainly not a pleasant place to be. For a long time, her work permit didn't come through, so she was just sitting around all day and not really welcomed so much in the community. And so right as I actually was filing my story, her work permit came through, and like just about everybody else that I spoke to was eager to find a job, and she did find a job and started working. And so that's where she is now. But like many working people in this country, she's still living in public housing in a de facto shelter, even as she gets up and goes to work every day.
Jordan, thank you so much for this. Thank you for telling these stories and giving us a look inside a pretty broken system.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Jordan Michael Smith, writing in Maclean's. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can send us feedback on this or any other episode. You can send us suggestions for episodes we should do in the future. You can tell us what you like about us and what you hate. The way to do it is with an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or a phone call to 416-935-5935, where you can leave a voicemail. The Big Story is available in every podcast player as well. It's on your smart speaker. Just ask it to play The Big Story Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.